What up, YouTube? It's DLAZ. I'm back at it again with another video, and today I decided Ryan DePaulo, he's old news. He's nothing compared to Rampage Poker, so let's jump on the bandwagon, take advantage of his 300,000 subs, and review some of his play from his most recent vlog, which includes a $200,000 hand with the one and only Mariano. Absolute clown. I'm gonna rip both of them to shreds at the end of this series. It's gonna be a two-part series. I got some good, valuable takes on different spots and ways to think about things, but more importantly, I dissect Rampage's comments. I just want to get it out there. I love Ethan. I think he's a good person. I think he's great for poker. I think his videos are entertaining. I've watched them. I'm not a hater at all. I hope he doesn't take any of this personal. I'm just jumping on the bandwagon, but I think it's great content. I think it's a good video, and I think you'll get both a couple laughs and most importantly, maybe learn a couple things. So stay tuned for part 2 and enjoy here part 1. Peace. All right, here we are right away getting into it. This is the first hand I'm going to talk about briefly. They start off here about 30K effective. This hand's between Rampage and Song. It's not Steven Song, a crusher friend of mine. Some guy named Song. I don't really watch these live cash games. Haven't seen him before. But Rampage is on the button. They have about 30K in the stack. It's 25.50, and then there's two straddles, it seems. So 25.50, 100, 200. So the 200 is going to act as the big blind in terms of figuring out the effective stack, because that's what the opening size is based on. I'm not using straddle sims just to keep things simple. You can. GTO Wizard does offer that. I just don't have access to those today. But I want to just take a look at this hand. We're going to consider it as 150-ish bigs effective, or 30,000 effective with a 200 big blind.
3 betting to 1,300. Action folds around to the cutoff who ends up making the call. So we're going to...
Okay, so he doesn't even get into the details, and he decides to make in my opinion, a bizarre decision to 3-bet Jack 7 off. The one main thing I want to point out here, and Ethan, if you're listening, you don't need to reach down this far to isolate bad players at the table, and my assumption is that's a big part of this. I know there's some kind of weird game going on with the getting paid if you win 3 hands in a row. There might be a dynamic that I completely miss, and if so, I apologize in advance, because then my analysis isn't totally fair. But just in general, people think that they need to get super out of line, or they can get away with 3-betting these hands that are just horrible. Now, first off, because there's 2 straddles, being on the button here, you still have 4 players left behind you to act. So right away, your range should be tighter. The cutoff range should be tighter. There are so many hands in our range in a chip EV cash game situation that are mixing 3-bets. We basically mix almost every hand wants to do some calling, some 3-betting, and then there's some hands that just want to 3-bet. No hands really want to do it always. So if you just, instead of reaching super far down, 3 or 4 pips off to use a hand like Jack 7-0, you can just take the hands that like to mix at certain frequencies and just 3-bet them always. It'll be far from deficient in having enough hands to 3-bet. You'll be just super aggressive. You'll find that you'll have still plenty of hands if you always 3-bet the hands that sometimes want to do so. We'll look at this a little more in depth in a little bit here. I don't want to get too detailed yet or ever in this video, but my point is this is just ridiculous, and he pays the price.
Play a 3-bet pot here, and the flop comes Queen 10-4, 2 diamonds. Got a whole lot of nothing, all things considered, but still got a bet as I want to fold out whatever he could have. I bet 1,000 into the middle, and my opponent quickly makes the call.
He just quickly tosses out $1,000 chip. I don't think it's a big deal. His reasoning is silly. He's like, I just want to get a fold from whatever. I mean, realistically, you're not going to generate that many folds on this board. The cutoff range interacts with this board immensely. We are going to bet here, I assume, pretty often. I would actually bet 25% pot if we're going to get nitpicky. But the reasoning isn't because you just want to win the fold, whatever. He's a professional. He should talk with a little more specifics, I think, as to what the goal of this bet is.
Call, which I just really wanted to win the pot right here and then, but when the turn is the 6 of spades, brings in 2 flush draws on the board. My opponent checks once again, and now definitely a decision-making point in the hand. On one hand, I have 0 equity, but on the other hand, I literally have Jack high and just want him to fold anything. But
0 equity and 0 equity, which is a good reason sometimes to check.
Card, and it comes the ace of clubs.
His check on turn is good. I think he played the hand well, actually.
Definitely one of those cards I wanted to see that maybe I can steal this one.
Up to this point.
Checks once again. And now, definitely going to size up, and I throw 4,000 into the middle. 4,000 into a $4,800 pot. It's almost a pot-sized bet, and
this could be relatively nitpicky. I don't think he puts a ton of thought into why he's betting what he's betting. He just goes kind of by feel, which is fine. And maybe he does it, he just isn't communicating it. I'd be curious why he picks an 80% pot size here and what his thought process, or if he even knows how to think that through. If you go to my first video, I go into more detail on how to kind of pick your bet sizing. Value determines our bet size. A lot of people base it on bluffs. That's a myth. It's value dictates bet sizing. So we would want to ask ourselves, what is our worst value bet? bet in any given spot, and then you can pick your size from here. When I'm this deep in cash, I would probably play 2 sizes plus all in on rivers like this, and I think it's a pretty clear spot where when he checks a third time here, the cutoff out of position, we could probably bet as far down even as like king queen and queen jack, and then we would obviously have really strong hands like aces and queens and king jack and pocket sixes, pocket tens if we just decide to take this like semi awkward line of checking turn with some of these stronger hands. I would compartmentalize my range into 2 sizes here. I would have like hands that mimic value betting a queen or maybe some weak ace x, and then I'd have hands that mimic valuing sets 2 pairs like ace 10 and king jack. And because of that, I'd probably use like a half pot sizing, maybe even a little less than half pot, even though on the river I don't love using less than half, like 40% pot. And then I would have like hands that want to bet like 150 over pot, like king jack and aces and ace 10. This size just doesn't really make a ton of sense for me. He's just kind of betting a bigger size because it feels right, it seems. And again,
My opponent
I think
is
the
not
opponent
going anywhere.
is sick
He
for this.
actually
This is
puts
a
in
good check raise. This
raise
has to be good.
1,500. And look at his stats.
He put a check raise to 15,000. Has to be good. Rampage ends up considering shoving, which is, again, this is why I think Rampage is awesome. This is why he does well in tournaments and has great results. Like, he's willing to pull the trigger in some 6 spots. And like I said, I think he played the hand overall well. I'm getting nitpicky on the river, being a bit of a nerd about it. But at the end of the day, he just shouldn't have been here. He gets check raised. He doesn't end up jamming. He folds. He loses a sizable pot. And like I said, it could have been avoided. Let's move on to the next hand. But this him being 2 wide pre is going to be a common theme throughout the video here. So just real quick to take a look at the pre-flop range. This is cutoff versus button. 150 bigs effective. Doesn't consider that there's 4 people behind us with straddles. This has no rake involved. Chip EV cash game scenario. And wherever you see green is hands that want to call here on the button versus cutoff open. Wherever you see pink are hands that want to 3-bet or mix 3-betting at a certain frequency if it's filled in a little bit. This is what I mean by not needing to reach down super far for a hand like Jack 7-0, which, by the way, 3-betting here loses 0.53 big blinds versus a normal cutoff open range. And that means just the action of 3-betting is losing that many chips. And this is only putting in 7 bigs. As we go from, flop to turn to river, that loss rate usually will compound. And that's assuming that obviously you're playing against a bot, but that doesn't really matter if your hand's really shitty. It doesn't matter who you're playing against. It's shitty for a reason. With that being said, if we, instead of reaching for like hands that have no properties to be 3-betting, and we just start increasing or filling in any hand where you see pink, which is basically the entire range, or even let's say 75% of these hands go from being mixing to pure 3-betting, take king 4 suited, which mostly folds, and some 3-bets and make it pure ace 9-0, which almost never does anything. You can even start reaching down the hands like ace 8-0, ace 7-0 if you want to start reaching, but that's really kind of where you end it. Ace 5-0, it's only losing 0.11 big blinds, 3-bet versus a bot. You're going to be aggressive enough, wide enough, you're going to be able to properly take advantage of the fishy players at the table and outplay them post flop and not leak a ton of EV, or self-inflicted EV, I should say. And the biggest reason you would want to use like hands that have good properties at 3-bet is because you still have 4 people in his dynamic behind you left to act. So you can't just pick any 2 cards that make straights. And you want to have removal on hands that are going to 4-bet you because you have still 4 ranges to get through. There's plenty of people that can show up with hands like ace king and ace queen, suited broadways and so on. So you want to at least use a hand with an ace or a king in it, or you want to use hands that can peel verse 4-bets in position and retain a ton of equity like suited connectors and play really well post flop. So his 3-bets just super out of line, and it's not necessary. You can still have an image of being aggressive and playing a wide enough VPIP to get invited back to games without having to do silly shit, and just instead take the hand to do it sometimes, which is almost everything, and use those always. It just basically doubles or triples the percentage of your range that's going to be 3-betting, and you're going to be VPIPing infinitely more here. Anyway, let's go to the next hand. All right, before we get to the next hand that I'm going to feature in this video, I just wanted to point out this spot here because it kind of leads into the next one. Basically, Rampage flop trips on the flop. He's in there at 5-2 suited, whatever. The river, he goes check. This guy bets and he finds a fold because it was pretty obvious the guy has a bluff when they're like 5 or 6 ways on the flop, has a flush. And he makes a comment about how this guy never bluffs, and he says it out loud, and that's the main reason why he folded. It was an easy fold. With that being said, it shows an example first of all, he plays well, but then he gets into his head in this next hand, and I'll talk about it a little more here in a second about the dynamics of the person trying to bluff him. And I promise you guys, like, stop worrying about dynamics, stop worrying about perception and what this guy thinks you might do if you do this and if he knows that. I'm telling you, at the end of the day, it has very little impacts on the EVs and decision making. If you just stick to like solid common sense almost theory, you'll make much more clear decisions at the table. And that doesn't mean you can't exploit, but it does mean that you're going to more likely make a mistake if you think the guy's gonna bluff me because he thinks that I think he he's never bluffing here. You just get into this guessing game. And once you start guessing in poker, it becomes very, very difficult. And you're going to find that the person probably wasn't thinking anything like what you were thinking and is just playing his cards. And people sometimes just have good hands. In some spots, they can only have good hands, which is a good segue here into the next really, really interesting pot that he plays. Okay, so this is again where I start to get a little confused, and maybe I'm just totally missing something really simple here about the game they're playing with, getting paid to win 3 hands in a row or whatever it may be. I don't know if they're playing at Squid Games or whatever the people are doing nowadays, and I sound like an old miserable reg, but he just opens king 9 offsuit from the cutoff and doesn't even give any justification into the reasoning why. I don't know if he thinks this is a normal thing to do. You don't need to do this. You just don't need to reach super far down to be playing enough hands and considered action and wide enough. There's enough hands that mix, raise, and fold. Make those pure opens. Pick from hands that have good playability, good removal. Use hands that are connected. Use hands that are suited. King 9 offsuit from low jack should be so far off this list. I mean, the king 10 offsuit probably doesn't even open pure from this spot. I mean, you could just do king 10-0 always and have plenty of hands, and then add, some jack 7 suited, some suited queen X. Open all your suited king X if you insist, but this hand just does horribly post flop, multi-way especially, and he pays the price here in this pot.
To a flop of ace king 9 rainbow, bottom 2 pair yet again. Looks like I'm hitting all of the cards I need to today, trying to string up the momentum to win in this session. I bet $800, and Efan is the only caller.
Efan, the guy he thinks is tight, and he baited. He made a comment already about how he might have baited him into bluffing him.
Pretty much ace 9 is the only hand he could have. Then that's pretty unfortunate, or even ace 5. But I'm gonna put that to the test as I put out an overbet of $4,500.
Now, keep in mind here, okay, the flop was multi-way. Rampage was the pre-flop raiser. He bets into a full table of people. This guy has someone still left to act behind and just clicks call. The other guy folds, and they get to the turn. Rampage's betting range here is going to already be incredibly narrowed than a normal heads-up pot. And the button's continuing range also is going to be incredibly narrowed because he's got people left to act behind still that could, check raise. So you can't just throw chips out there without thinking too much with a lot of backdoor equity. So he already is going to have some sort of hand that is either strong enough to continue and has showdown value or is a value candidate, or he's going to have very clear queen jack of clubs, jack 10 of clubs, maybe at the worst. That's basically where it ends. He doesn't have 10-8 of clubs or 10-8 of spades or diamonds, for example. So just keep that in mind as we go.
Thinking that on a brick turn card, I can just fire a lot more. Efan's not going to have the strongest hands like aces and kings, and maybe not even nines, as they could throw me to 13,000. Oh.
Efan raises here to 13,000 in position, which is not good. I mean, it's just a bizarre action to take here when the guy bets flop and then overbets turn. I think Rampage's bet on the turn is actually really, really good. I think a lot of people screw this up. I don't think overbetting is necessary. It feels off in these multi-way spots in cash where ranges are so tight. However, a big size makes sense because if you think about when Rampage bets twice here, and again, value dictates your bet sizing, he's going to only have really, really, really strong hands. He might not even start betting ace queen on the flop. I think ace queen is pretty clearly going to check on the turn. He might have some ace x of clubs that he can just continue to put a lot of chips in. I don't think he's going to overbet those, but at the very worst, generally what you're going to see people bet twice with here is hands like ace king, ace 9, pocket 9s. If he decided to start trying to bluff with 5s on the flop, he would continue on turn, pocket kings, and that's it. It's 2 pairs plus sets, 2 pairs. With that being said, if you're only going to be betting your absolute strongest possible hands here, you're going to use a really big size. I'd probably expect to see a size like pot if we're in a heads up pot. If this was low jack versus button, single raise, not multi-way. I'm not so sure about the multi-way dynamic here, how it would impact it exactly. But with that being said, I like his size. But when you face a really polar size and you're in position on the button, very rarely are you going to be able to play raises. But if someone does raise you in these spots, they don't really have too many weak hands. Just consider that. Think about what they're going to do. You think they're going to look down at queen jack of clubs now, not raise on the flop, get here, jack 10 of clubs, and be now's a good time to try and raise in position. Think about how much easier it is when you have draws to just click call in position and see a river. You don't necessarily just start raising to a size on the turn that allows your opponent to now 4-bet all in, which you should expect to happen at some amount here, at some reasonable clip when the guy bets into so many people on the flop and barrels or over pot on the turn. So once they raise, alarms should be going off in your head in general. But let's finish this hand and then we'll talk about it a little more.
Bro, this is not super friendly. I mean, I'm playing against one of the tighter opponents at the table. I just baited him saying he doesn't bluff enough. Could he be bluffing here? I'm not 100% sure, but I definitely need a call. My hand is too good to fold at this moment. And here we go. We got a big pot ballooning up on the river we go, which is the queen of diamonds.
Horrible
So
card.
some straight draws get there. I check it to EFAN as he has the betting lead.
On the river, EFAN bets just under pot, like 25,000. We'll call it a pot size for argument's sake. Again, Rampage is too wrapped up in the fact that he might bluff him. What fucking bluffs does he have? You telling me that the most tightest guy at the table is going to look down at Queen Jack of clubs now on the river? Again, after he decides to continue flop and raise the turn versus the way the action went, and now bluff river. Like, what are we expecting him to have a bluff with? King X of clubs, like King Jack and King 10 of clubs. Savage would be a cool play here, right? But I just don't expect to see that often. And I don't think they're going to raise turn. That would be so fishy, like so ridiculous from the raise turn and now also bluff river to get us the full 2 pair. So it's just really hard for him to have any bluffs at all. Anybody to have any bluffs here. I don't think you'd have to really try to find them and have to get really creative. And he doesn't have worse value. Maybe the worst ace X this guy could have here is like ace queen of clubs, which guess what? Now made 2 pair. Or maybe ace queen O that he wants to raise turn and then check back river makes 2 pair. The point being is they don't really have worse than king 9. And he gets into this like mindset, and I'm not going to even play the clip, but he says something along the lines of like, if I have any respect for this guy's game, my hand's just too strong to fold. And this is a common mistake that players make. They think the solver is like, if you're going to play like a solver, like you have to make these very questionable calls in certain spots. But the solver also will recognize in certain spots that people just can't have enough bluffs. They don't call nearly as wide as some people think in like very obvious spots where you're going to just be beat almost always. And that's why I tell people like theory at the end of the day will take out the guessing and allow you to make more clear and as close to accurate as possible decisions that over time will make the most amount of chips. And that's because like the solver does fold spots where you would not expect to see sets, or a flush comes in, they will fold sets facing aggression, facing all ins, facing big bets. They'll definitely fold 2 pairs. And I'm going to show you guys something interesting here in a second of how the sim would look at this spot. But I just wanted to talk about his mindset, and it all comes down to this like kind of fishy way to think that, oh, this dynamic of he heard me say that I don't think he ever bluffs, so now he's going to float any 2 and get to river and then raise the turn on this like ridiculously under bluff board texture and then fire out a bet. Like you can save $25,000 here, which is a massive amount of chips. Let's take a look at the sim real quick. All right, so I had to get a little bit creative here to get the sim to theoretically display what I'm trying to show here in this spot, which is a very different spot. Again, multi-way and heads up is not identical, and you can't look at a single raise pot to study a multi-way spot. But I just want to prove a point here. The issue was on the turn, it was if we were betting twice, which makes sense, it wanted to use a pot size. So I gave a small size. The issue is when you bet pot on the turn, the in-position player will never raise, and for obvious reasons, because your range is capped and his range is so polar that most of our strong hands just don't really benefit from raising here, and it's going to be hard to have like high equity bluffs because we should expect his range to be so strong that we're going to face maybe another raise, a jam, all in, or whatever it may be on the turn. So you kind of just are forced to play calls, and in position that's going to often be the case as just a general idea. However, if you put a block size in, it does give raises. The solver would play, if this was a single raise pot, a quarter bet on the flop, and you can see the difference with the single raise pot. Like his range is going to be much wider. I mean, he does start to raise some things on the flop, which you would expect to see now that he's not going to do in the multi-way spot, but he's also going to be able to continue hands like 5s at some amount, and I think people probably call them way more often than the solver even indicates here. But in multi-way, they're never going to continue with 5s, so it's not so far off to what his turn range is going to look like. But he's just going to have a lot of these like suited hands that interact with the board in a single raise spot that he wouldn't have otherwise. So that gives him more hands that would bluff here per se on the turn when facing a 25% block size. You can see like even 9x starts to do some raising here because obviously you want to match your bluffs to your value when you're bluffing. We never went into that really, maybe in a future video. But either way, I give him the raise size at B50. The solver automatically inputs that sizing when we change it to a block on the turn. And then the Queen of Diamonds river, which again is a horrible river just in general. And I changed the size here to match the size he bet in game. It wants to use like a pot or over pot size, which again makes sense, and all in, which is a reasonable strategy here. And look what happens when the robotic artificial intelligence, which is going to meet minimum defense frequency, is still folding King 9 suited in pure. And obviously we don't have King 9-0 here, but it's folding King 9 suited pure. It's folding Ace 9 suited, almost always, depending on the suit combination or suit distribution. Obviously it's going to call Ace King suited, which makes some sense because we beat some value, but it just goes to show that you're wrong when you start to think sometimes that, forget dynamics, that if you respect the person as a player, you just have to call your hands too strong. I'm telling you, in general, if you start thinking about a spot and you start coming to a conclusion that even a solver will be very hard to find bluffs in certain spots, you could definitely fold really, really high up. And King 9 here is as good as not much. much, right? It's as strong as a 1-pair hand because he's not going to be raising a single pair ace-x on the turn that then value bets on the river. So it, ace-jack and king-9 are probably pretty close in value. I mean, obviously ace-jack does some calling here because it blocks jack-10 suited, but it still mostly folds, right? The main point remains the same, that besides forgetting dynamics or something that you said, and that's going to somehow impact some decision that someone's making to be like super out of line, especially when you're multi-way where ranges are super tight to begin with. Once the flop comes out, continuing ranges are tight, and then raising ranges for big bet are going to be even tighter. And then on river, you have to think about now, like, what are their bluffs? You can't just think that, oh, he might have bluffs. I'm watching the hand, I see what they have. I couldn't really think of a reasonable hand that Efan could ever use as a bluff in this spot. He might literally be a spot where he has 0 bluffs, 0 worse value than king 9. He might even check back a hand like 9-5 suited if he somehow had that here, or a hand like king 9 himself on the river after raising turn. You could even argue that, like, basing the raise on the turn, like maybe king 9 suited can start hitting the muck. It's not like the craziest thought. Now, I'm not saying I would definitely continue and then decide on river what to do, but on this river where the only bluffs he could have, either probably just checks and gives up like queen jack suited and hopes somehow he beats something, or they get there like jack 10 of clubs, right? So with that being said, this is the end of part 1. Next part is going to be insane. I'm going to go through the $200,000 hand that him and Mariano played, and I swear it's got to be the arguably worst hand I've ever watched anyone play. Not just these guys. They're kind of just clicking buttons. The thought process of Mariano is just out of whack. So keep an eye on that. Be coming up here in a couple of days. I hope you guys enjoyed this style of video. I know you only did 2 hands, but I hope you got some value out of it. And yeah, I had fun. Let me know who you want to see me watch next in the comments below. Peace.
He's still not over the main event bust. You know what I'm doing.